A very good morning. If we can all perhaps kindly take the seats. Thank you so much. My name is Michael Wiener, and I have the pleasure to co-moderate today this first session together with Maria D'Arienzo. And she will shortly start with an introductory note in Italian, and then we'll proceed afterwards in English with all the various speakers, but then also have the opportunity of engaging in an interactive dialogue. So for that, we have also roaming microphones for any questions and answers. So without further ado, Maria D'Arienzo, you have the floor.
Buongiorno a tutti. Saluto tutti i presenti, le autorità confessionali, istituzionali e i partecipanti tutti. Diamo inizio a questa sessione di lavori del convegno G20 INTERFAITH Forum 2021, così ricco e ben strutturato, e ringrazio innanzitutto il professore Alberto Melloni per l'invito di cui sono onorata. La sessione di stamane è dedicata alla tutela della libertà religiosa e alla protezione delle minoranze. Tematica certamente centrale. Potremmo dire anzi che è la tematica forse più appropriata per inquadrare il rapporto tra libertà religiosa e tutela del pluralismo e delle identità specifiche, il cui fulcro è rappresentato dalla tutela della diversità, quale declinazione del principio di eguaglianza delle libertà e nelle libertà. Il concetto di minoranza rinvia di per sé alla presenza di una maggioranza diversamente riguardata e acquista una sua specificità in termini di tutela a seconda dei distinti contesti geopolitici in cui questo concetto è considerato. Si pensi ad esempio al ruolo che è attribuito alle minoranze nell'archetipo di entità politica delineato dalla Carta di Medina, in cui le comunità religiose non islamiche, ma di fede monoteista, sono considerate simili alla umma musulmana e in quanto tali assumono il rango di comunità protette, cui riconoscere autonomia giurisdizionale e libertà di culto, in cui tuttavia il concetto di protezione può essere interpretato non come mera tolleranza, ma in quanto riconoscimento della comune protezione divina. Del resto, questo approccio è stato anche confermato nella recente dichiarazione di Marrakech del 2016, in cui tutti i gruppi religiosi sono chiamati a partecipare alla cittadinanza inclusiva sulla base della loro piena tutela dei diritti e delle libertà. In realtà il concetto di minoranza è uno di quei concetti multiprospettici che va riguardato nel suo rapporto di interdipendenza dinamica con lo spazio globale. È un concetto che potremmo dire, difatti, definire multisituato. Una minoranza in un contesto può essere maggioranza altrove. E proprio tale processo dinamico di interdipendenza ha in sé il potenziale di universalizzazione dei significati a cui il diritto e soprattutto i giuristi sono chiamati a conferire forma e sostanza ai fini della costruzione di un tessuto sociale non conflittuale ma di rispetto reciproco. In questo processo operativo di destrutturazione della dimensione spaziale del concetto di minoranza, importante è certamente il ruolo delle religioni, al fine di creare quel continuum comunicativo capace di riempire di sostanza emotiva il linguaggio dei diritti, attraverso la ricerca di una sintesi dialogante delle esperienze concrete nelle specifiche realtà sociali. Un altro dei principi che il concetto di minoranza evoca è difatti quello di non discriminazione. Come è noto, la protezione delle minoranze religiose è un obiettivo affermato in numerose dichiarazioni internazionali. Ricordiamo innanzitutto dalla Convenzione ONU per la repressione del crimine di genocidio del 48, alla Convenzione UNESCO del 60 sulla lotta alla discriminazione all'insegnamento, la Convenzione dell'ONU per l'eliminazione di tutte le forme di discriminazione razziale del 66. Sicuramente significativa in materia di tutela delle minoranze è inoltre la disposizione di cui all'articolo 27 del Patto ONU sui diritti civili e politici del 66, senza dimenticare inoltre la dichiarazione sui diritti delle persone appartenenti a minoranze nazionali o etniche, religiose e linguistiche dell'ONU del 92 e la conferenza di Vienna sui diritti umani del 93, unitamente alle altre dichiarazioni regionali emanate in ambito europeo, africano, americano e alle dichiarazioni islamiche dei diritti dell'uomo. Ciò nonostante, ancora oggi, troppo spesso, le minoranze, soprattutto religiose, sono vittime di notevoli discriminazioni. Nel tentativo di trovare possibili soluzioni ai frequenti fenomeni di intolleranza nei confronti delle comunità religiose minoritarie, va sottolineato come anche rispetto alla tutela della libertà religiosa possa risultare fondamentale il ruolo in particolare di quello che è stata definita la diplomazia religiosa. Lo strumento della diplomazia religiosa, infatti, a differenza della funzione rivestita nelle relazioni tra gli stati, assume un senso differente, che emerge con nettezza, soprattutto con specifico riguardo alla prevenzione e alla composizione dei conflitti e quindi nell'impegno alla costruzione della pace e della cooperazione tra i popoli. Una diplomazia che parte dal basso al fine della difesa di una maggiore giustizia nella società. Pertanto costituisce un dato ormai acquisito quello dell'importanza del coinvolgimento degli attori confessionali e leaders religiosi nell'impegno diretto alla costruzione della pace e nella tutela dei diritti. Impegno che però richiede necessariamente un'azione sinergica delle varie istituzioni internazionali allo scopo di garantire l'effettività di tali diritti delle comunità minoritarie anche sul piano internazionale, oltre che in ambito interno. Grazie alla presenza di chi è concretamente impegnato in questa direzione, la composizione della sessione di lavori di stamane mi sembra la più adatta per far emergere la necessità di un impegno sinergico tra gli attori istituzionali e confessionali nella tutela della libertà religiosa e della protezione delle minoranze. Saluto quindi gli autorevoli relatori, Abdellah Massimo Cozzolino, Fernand e Varennes, Susan Kerr, Kizra Kam, Sharon Kleiman, Ronald Rashman. E prima di dare inizio ai lavori, cedo la parola a Michael Wiener per la prosecuzione dei lavori. Grazie a tutti.
Thank you so much, Maria. And at today's session on freedom of religion or belief, protecting minorities, we're going to zoom into very specific questions and challenges across the world that are facing so many communities. So the idea is really to look into minority rights, to see how these religious or belief minorities could be defined, also by whom, and how to also effectively promote equality in that context. Just to give you two very recent examples of challenges that all of you are aware of. First, of course, the problems in terms of hate speech on social media, which is specifically targeting religious or belief minorities across the world. And linked to that, you also have stigmatization of minorities, especially in the current COVID-19 context, where basically minorities are stigmatized as carriers of the virus and are also facing attacks and discrimination accordingly. And just to give you one quote of the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, Dr. Fernand de Varennes, who is also one of our distinguished speakers today, he already more than a year ago publicly said, COVID-19 endangers the health of all of us with no distinction as to language, religion, or ethnicity. But some are more vulnerable than others. All of us can take steps to resist the rise in hate speech against minorities in social media. So with this, I would pass the floor to Abdellah Massimo Cozzolino. Dr. Cozzolino is the General Secretary of the Italian Islamic Confederation, which is the biggest Islamic organization in Italy. He's also a board member of the Big Mosque of Rome, an advisor to the Ministry of Interior in the Consultative Committee for Italian Islam, and member of the European Commission Center of Excellence on Violent Radicalization, RAN. And we are very much looking forward to hearing also the specific challenges that religious minorities face and whatever in your experience has been done or could be done to address this in future. Dr. Cozzolino.
Thank you very much to the chair and the co-chair, and thanks to all the speakers. Let me just make a preliminary remark to my speech on this subject, saying that it will be from an European and West perspective. So, for people in doubt with the conservative sensitivity or simply with the common sense, the connection between a religion and political community seems to be obvious. It is religion, our faith, our attitude towards the divine, which finally determined the foundation and the essential shape of each community. This connection was already well known since the ancient times. 200 years ago, a great German philosopher, Hegel, reminded us that, I quote, "A nation which has a false or bad conception of God also has a bad state, a bad government, and bad laws." End of quotation. This is why it is necessary to look upon today's crisis in Europe and the Western world as, above all, a religious crisis. But what does it mean? For many, this crisis means the fall of religiousness, of faith, which is manifested by the abandonment of religion, the progressive secularization, the ethnization of Western societies. However, this diagnosis seems to be only partly true. We are indeed dealing with a crisis of religion and Western civilization, but it's not caused by the abandonment of religion as such. Right opposite. This may be surprising for many, but we live now in a times of unusually fierce religion identification and growth. And I'm not thinking only to Islam and Muslim, but also to other movements and other religions. In all their differences, they have an essential and common character. It's presented, usually referred to religion with a tone of indifference and superiority, treating each religion as an element of backwardness and social underdevelopment, something which is opposed to human reason and freedom. First remark, I want to take concentration about some wars. So the first two key wars are respect and defend, as we have listened also in the chair introduction. That must be underlined and understood in a very serious way, because if we have a vision of society and of life coming from any cultural or spiritual and religious dimensions, and we want to implement the defense of sacredness of universal values, we should consider these two key wars as common work that unifies while respecting diversities. Secular democratic institutions are now seriously engaging on analysis on religious freedom as a fundamental right and linking this in international relations and policies. These kind of analysis help to better understand the need of religious literacy, which is rather lacking and which is often viewed with fear because it's interpreted with political categories. In the Marrakesh Declaration that has been mentioned, hundreds of Muslim and intellectual scholars from over 120 nations, together with representatives of Islamic International Organization, gathered in Marrakesh the problem of protection of religious minorities in countries where the population is predominantly composed of faithful Muslims, mark a fundamental stage in the process of formal construction and protection of the right to religious freedom with respect to societies such as those of countries with an Islamic majority. The drafter of this document identified in the Charter of Medina an essential reference to guarantee the rights of religious minority in the land of Islam, have in fact taken a position in favor of the formal recognition and therefore legal protection of freedom religion and its concrete exercise within countries with an Islamic majority. They also appealed the word of Muslim jurists for a reformulation of the right of religious freedom as a right of all and for all. Therefore, also for Muslim, anchored to a non-political but inclusive idea of citizenship, functional to the creation of society in which confessional pluralism can coexist with the fundamental principles of the Quran and the Sunnah. Second remark, there are other three wars I want to stress here as a proposal for policies, just taking from my experience. These three wars are identity, discrimination, and practice. Identity regards the perception of reality from what is marginal to what is mainstream, which is very difficult to manage. And on the other side, it's not only as a lack of information or knowledge, but it's rather misinformation and disinformation. So these are the challenges in terms of identity religious citizens and believers and leaders need to face. And therefore, we see the abuse of religion and the justification of any violent acts thanks to mention of religious identity in the name of God. There is an instrumentalization of doctrine and or dogmatic extremist interpretation as a challenge for believers for believers, especially for members of the same community, and for all citizens and institutional governments worldwide. In this time of pandemic crisis, we have seen the flourishing of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, especially on the social, that blame Jews for alleged interest. The idea is to preserve and work for this clearly and truly authentic identity. We probably need to train a new generation of scholars, of religious, reliable advisors that can link between their true knowledge of their identity, but with two extra skills. The first one is the science of interpretation, and the second one is the contextualization. Otherwise, we are only copying and pasting doctrine without an intellectual or spiritual understanding and trying to implement this as a formalistic bigotry in our society. We need a new generation of reliable previous leader that can make this empowerment of a task force that can follow several issues in different regions of the world, that can help in terms of visibility and interreligious committee, that can try to show, as we are doing here in Bologna, how the harmony of interreligious relation can help coexistence, but also the values and the rights. The second case would be discrimination, or rather hatred or persecution, against which we need to combine probably some new guideline, because at least we have two different ways of considering discrimination, hatred and persecution. On one side, we have probably the kind of West institution, secularized institution, the populism, and the other side, we have totalitarianism. So there is a great difference between the discrimination in the East as well as in the West. The consequence of these two narrow-minded of the extremist interpretation in politics is double standards of citizens and believers. So we have an ultra-secular extremism and a confessional extremism. We think that the solution could be in the interconfessional interreligious service task force that can link the difference, unity, and diversity among religions, among minorities and majority religions, but also in the context of a secular postmodern society. The third key was, very briefly, and I conclude, it's how to put in practice our intention and sensitivity or dialogue knowledge. This last point, it's a question of our prayers, preaching rituals, place of the holy place, religious community in a secular context around. As it can be in Europe, needs to be discussed with passions and with the clear vision of the contents and its true dialogue and knowledge between the religious trained leaders and the consistent secular institution, that some practical solution can find their way without any discrimination. Thank you for the attention.
Mille grazie, Dottore Cozzolino. Thank you so much for this perspective, specifically from a minority in Europe and in the Western world. And also your reference to the particular challenges in the time of the pandemic, COVID-19, I think was very pertinent. And I appreciated very much also you referring to the problems in terms of anti-Semitic hate speech. And I think that's in the interfaith spirit of this G20 Interfaith Forum, a key point that various communities not only look into the situation of their own community, but also of other minorities. That was also a point that the High Commissioner and Special Rapporteurs have really made, that it's so important to have really this interfaith approach. And it's so much more also efficient if the various communities come together and support each other. And also the other point that you raised about religious literacy is also spot on. And I would add also, it's not only the religious literacy which is missing or could be improved, but it's also the freedom of religion or belief literacy, which is lacking. Again, something which special rapporteurs have raised at various points. This is, I think, the perfect segue to go to the special rapporteur on minority issues, Dr. Fernand de Varennes. He has been since 2017 the special rapporteur, and as part of his mandate, he is the reference point on the protection of human rights of national or ethnic, religious and linguistic minorities globally. He's also extraordinary professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria and adjunct professor at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and Chen Yutong, a visiting professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong. He's renowned as one of the world's leading experts on international human rights of minorities and has extensive, more than 200 publications in more than 30 languages. So I think that's also a really important point to not only divulge this in English or in some languages, but having it really available in all the various local languages. And with this, perhaps I would ask also the special rapporteur to see and to describe how, from his perspective, the evolution of how religious or belief minorities are portrayed and treated around the world, and what would be the main trends you can identify in terms of mutual understanding between cultures and upholding human rights. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Michael. Signora Professor D'Arienzo, Mesdames et Messieurs, bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. Bienvenuto a tutti. Shalom, assalamu alaikum. Many thanks for the very kind introduction, by the way, Michael. Please allow me to begin with a few words to express first my gratitude to the organizers of the G20 Interfaith Forum, including the Fondazione per le Scienze Religiose and many others, of course, for the honor and privilege of being part of this event with such a distinguished panel. The overarching theme of this forum is a time to heal, which begs the question, time to heal from what? What is the illness we need to address for increased understanding between religions and mutual understanding of cultures? If we look at globally, who would doubt that the world seems to be getting sicker? Not only is our environment increasingly depleted, destabilized by man-made factors leading to global warming and the resources that are also disappearing, but the minds and souls of our societies are increasingly being poisoned by growing intolerance, racism, and prejudices, which increasingly are spreading like a pandemic through social and other media. And speaking of the pandemic, there may sometimes be a tendency of blaming everything on COVID-19. But what the COVID-19 has done is highlighted and probably to a degree exacerbated the inequalities between the have and have-nots, between countries and within societies. The deep fault lines between the ultra-rich, who are getting richer, and growing underclasses within society. But we all know these existed before the arrival of the virus. And this may sound alarming, but there has been for a number of years, uncontestable and increasingly worrying trends. Hate speech against religious or belief minorities everywhere, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, hatred against Roma, and Dalits, against Christians or Buddhist minorities, and many others have increasingly, significantly been going up in most parts of the world. Data from the United States, from the FBI just a few weeks ago, show that last year, hate crimes have risen to their highest level in over a decade in the United States. And that the majority of the reported hate crimes in that country target minorities. In fact, minorities seem to represent around 80% of the reported hate crimes in that country. Despite efforts of the United Nations to eradicate statelessness, for example, the lack of citizenship, and the ensuing denial of some of the most basic of human rights, the phenomenon of statelessness is actually increasing. And most of these stateless people, in fact, more than 3/4 of the stateless people around the world are from minority backgrounds. By the way, not accidental statelessness. The majority of these stateless minorities become stateless because of intentional policies and legislation by a few countries which lead to millions becoming stateless. The Rohingya in Myanmar is a perfect example. But the trend is growing in the sense that statelessness is actually increasing around the world. There are policies in India currently which may lead to mainly Muslim minorities becoming stateless. We have failed at the United Nations because statelessness is actually going up and not being eradicated. The number of violent internal conflicts in the world has also been increasing in the last decade, not going down. And with this, well, there are increasing atrocities, hunger, rape, and killings. And in most of these conflicts, minorities are often amongst those that are in the middle of it, even if strictly it's not because of their religion, it's not because of their ethnicity. Most often, these conflicts emerge because of long-standing grievances not being addressed, and people in the end resorting to violence more to try to redress this, or where the frustration remains largely unaddressed. But let me emphasize once again that what we're seeing here is not new. Almost 900 years ago, the Muslim Andalusian philosopher and jurist Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, wrote, "Ignorance leads to fear, fear leads to hate, hate leads to violence." That's what we're seeing here. What we're seeing, in a sense, is propagated through social media and new technology. What is new is the almost unimpeded spreading of ignorance and prejudice. We live in uncertain and unsettled times, times of upheaval, when governments seem unable or unwilling to solve very difficult social, economic, and even environmental challenges made worse by a pandemic. And these uncertainties and anxieties have been weaponized by a broad range of extremists, conspiracy theorists, and disinformation actors who have sought to propagandize, radicalize, and mobilize captive audiences online, usually. And this has been, in fact, increasing and growing. These are conditions conducive to the old phenomenon of scapegoating, of finding easy solutions to complex situations by, well, you know how it works, by blaming someone else. And blaming someone else has, throughout much of our history, been to blame the other, the foreigner, the outsider, the minority. The world is seeing, amidst this current pandemic, growing discrimination and hate speech against certain minorities and migrants, Asians, Muslims, Roma, Jews, people of Afro descent. In some countries, for example, in some Asian countries, immigrants and religious minorities have been blamed for the spread of the virus. In India, you have Muslims who are often the target of hate speech and even incitement to violence in relation connected to the spread of the virus, it's so claimed. But hate speech was not born with the pandemic. It's clear from various sources that hate speech against minorities has been gaining ground in most parts of the world through the huge impact of social media. And I'd like to summarize very briefly the trends that I'm experiencing or I'm seeing by quoting from a statement of the UN Secretary General recently, Antonio Guterres, from the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on hate speech. And I quote, "Around the world, we are seeing a disturbing groundswell of xenophobia, racism, and intolerance, including rising anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, and persecution of Christians. Social media and other forms of communication are being exploited as platforms for bigotry. Neo-Nazi and white supremacy movements are on the march. Public discourse is being weaponized for political gain with incendiary rhetoric that stigmatizes and dehumanizes minorities, migrants, refugees, women, and any so-called other." End of quote. Almost all of those examples are actually minorities. And to paraphrase the Secretary General again, the evil we're facing is a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, particularly in social and other media. And to be more precise, it's a tsunami mainly engulfing minorities. The evolution we're seeing is disturbing, and you're not immune to this here in Europe. Among the key findings of the 2018 hate crime data covering countries of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, more than 76% of hate crimes involve Jewish, Muslim, and other ethnic and religious minorities. A similar pattern can be found in most countries around the world, as a matter of fact. And for social media, in a few countries with reliable data, it seems that minorities appear to be more than 3/4 of all targets of hate speech in social media. At the risk of repeating myself and being perhaps too blunt, the vast majority, most, absolutely overwhelmingly so even, targets of hate speech are minorities. Social media owners have become the richest businesses and people in the world. But their business model is based on algorithms which lead to tunnel vision, rabbit holing, of encouraging, in the end, very narrow interests and views, as well as, in the end, intolerance, and reinforces bigotry, and feeds growing nationalism and extremism, left and right. This nationalism, increasing nationalism and extremism being propelled and fed and nourished by social media ends up stigmatizing and discrimination against mainly minorities in violation of their equal human rights and in denial of their humanity and dignity. But of course, there are initiatives and measures that need to be noted and on which we can build on to try to break this circle or this cycle of ignorance, fear, and hate. For example, I think we need to refer to the 18 commitments contained in the Beirut Declaration on Faith for Rights, for example. And there's the Rabat Plan of Action that highlights where most of the attention and efforts should be aimed at if we are to effectively foster greater understanding. Those two measures, initiatives, do refer to minorities, but I think much more needs to be done. Because remember, most hate crimes, most hate speech, most victims of statelessness, most victims of atrocities around the world are committed against minorities. So most of our efforts and approaches should focus on the main victims, those that are most vulnerable, and that means minorities. The world needs healing. Healing for the increased ignorance and fear that is poisoning populations of different religions and cultures, fueled by social media. It will not be done only by preaching to the converted. It has to be a global responsibility, a global approach that needs to look at and address the patterns which I've briefly mentioned through education, through policies, through legislation, to working collaboratively, but also needing to systematically address the absence of liability and responsibility that seems to be propagated in the current management and approach to social media. We need policies for inclusiveness, not only tolerance, to encourage embracement, if you will, of our human diversity and beauty of that diversity, so that we can try to tackle directly and effectively the poison of the mind that afflicts too many. And so currently, and so is understanding between religions and cultures, and especially which spreads hate and violence against minorities. Mesdames et messieurs, merci à vous. Grazie a tutti.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Rapporteur spécial. Many thanks for this enlightening statement. And also just to pick up the key point of statelessness that you raised at the beginning, which is not accidentally targeting minorities across the world. And you mentioned, obviously, the Rohingya in Myanmar and Muslims in India, but also elsewhere. So I think that's a key point that we should always keep in mind and try to address from the UN, but also from member states' perspective. And then also the reference that you made about the social media platforms being really a key platform for spreading hatred and bigotry, the tsunami of hatred that you referred to. And also just to pick up the point that you referred to the various existing tools, including the Rabat Plan of Action, precisely addressing incitement to hatred and violence. And also, I think the 18 commitments on faith for rights, there's one specific commitment, which is even incidentally linking to the title of this very session. And let me just read you this commitment 6. We pledge to stand up for the rights of all persons belonging to minorities and to defend their freedom of religion or belief, as well as their right to participate equally and effectively in cultural, religious, social, economic, and public life. So I think that's a nice even summary of the topic that we are discussing today. And with this, I would turn over the floor to Gady Gronich. He's the Chief of Staff to the President of the Conference of European Rabbis and Executive Director of the Conference of European Rabbis Foundation. He has staff responsibilities, giving direction for development policies and managing several European offices at the same time with the responsibility of Hadassah and Hillel Foundation, and responsible for the event management of more than 180 events all over Europe, from congresses with 2,000 participants, I guess before COVID-19, to smaller exclusive board meetings. And looking forward to hearing from you the perspective of the particular challenges that the Jewish communities are facing globally. Thank you.
Good morning. And thank you for inviting me to speak. I stand here as a representative of the Conference of European Rabbis, which represent around 85% of Jews and Jewish communities in Europe and is mandated to define their religious rights. The title of this panel is Freedom of Religion and Belief. which make an important distinction between the broader category of religious freedom and the much narrower category of freedom of belief. Very often people conflate the two. When they talk about freedom of religion, they are referring to the freedom of to believe what you like and worship whatever deity you choose according to your own customs. But there is another element of freedom of religion which is often overlooked. Indeed, it is currently under a threat in Europe. I'm talking about freedom of religious practice. And I would like to say a few words about this. In recent years, we have seen a growing wave of restrictions applied to religious practice in Europe. This wave is being driven by radical ideologies of both far right and far left of the political spectrum, swelled by the rising tide of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hatred for other religious minorities, as well by growing secularist contempt of traditional religious belief and practice. The steps I'm referring to include laws banning or limiting rituals slaughter for both Jews and Muslims in Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and others. Means restriction access to kosher and halal meat, as well the introduction of laws against male circumcision and various other restrictions. The list also includes the recent ruling by the European Court of Justice in support of bans against religious clothing in the workplace in cases in which female Muslim employees were required to remove headscarves and a Christian employee to remove a cross from around her neck. This restriction and ruling are making Europe inhospitable for Jews, not less than for other minorities groups. It is all very well proclaiming freedom of religion in Europe and fixing that freedom in law or proclaiming commitment to the protection of minorities of all kinds. But when restriction on religious practice become common, then such proclamation ring hollow. Some have sought to rescue the Jewish community by claiming that these restrictions have largely been introduced to discourage Muslim immigration to the continent, rather than being directly specific against Jews, who are merely innocent bystanders in this issue. Whatever the merit of such an argument, or indeed of such a policy, if true, this would simply mean the Jewish life in Europe is being as an acceptable causally in the struggle over the issue of immigration, a message to Europe Jews citizens that is no less harmful and insulting. But more broadly, I would like to note that this is not just a Jewish problem or a Muslim problem. Rather, it's a trend that affects all religious minorities. As the political maps become more polarized and extremist voices on all sides gain a greater prominence, a growing range of religious practice which serve for so many generations as the bedrock for a shared cultural identity, face a growing threat. This serves as a sharp reminder that Europe needs to double down on efforts to raise the siren call extremism from whatever direction it comes, and to combat attempts at normalizing extremist ideologies and behavior. In this context, I must also call attention to another growing threat to welfare of Jews and other minority groups in Europe, that of hate speech. In recent years, we have unfortunately witnessed a rising number of violent and deadly attacks on Jews and Jewish communities across the continent. But these attacks do not emerge in a vacuum. They are fostered in anti-Semitic hate speech that is given free governance across the wide range of social media platforms, in which provide the ideological legitimacy for acts of violence. A study published in June by the European Commission found a huge rise in anti-Semitic hate speech on Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram over the last year. A 7-fold increase in anti-Semitic content in French, and over a 13-fold increase in anti-Semitic content in German on Facebook. Anti-Semitic content in French received over 500,000 likes, comments, and shares over the period surveyed. And on Twitter, it received over 3 million retweets and likes. Meanwhile, anti-Semitic content in German on Telegram was viewed over 2 billion times in the same period. Let me just repeat that number again, 2 billion views just in one language. And of course, it's not just a Jew, and of course, it is not just Jews who are the targets of hate speech. A similar number of attacks are directed against Muslims, immigrants, and indeed against every possible religious, ethnic, and racial minority in Europe. Without question, religious freedom must be balanced against other freedoms, such as freedom of speech. But the facts show that we have failed miserably to find the right balance in the digital age. Now Europe must act firmly accountable, not only those who try to spread the vile-hearted against Jews and other minorities groups, but also the social media companies who continue to profit from the spread of racism, conspiracy theories, falsehoods. This cannot be allowed to continue, and efforts to improve legislation and enforcement across Europe should be supported and stepped up. In closing, I would like to note that the timing of this conference means that we are currently in the midst of the 10-day period, beginning with Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, which we celebrate last week, and ending with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which begins on Wednesday evening. In Jewish belief, this is the time of judgment, when deeds of all human beings over the last year are weighted and assessed by the Almighty, and the fate sealed for the year ahead. Those who refer to this period of the 10 days of repentance, when we engage in self-reflection and review our actions, try to atone for our errors and sins, and resolve to the better next year. This is an appropriate time for us all to think about how to improve things for religious and ethnic minorities in Europe, to ensure that all free and to live and practice according to the demands of their faith and way of life, and that all are free from specter of hate speech and violence. And finally, I would like to wish you all the traditional Jewish blessing of Gmar Chatima Tova. May the Lord sign and seal your judgment for a good year, a year of health and prosperity, and a year of understanding and acceptable among all people of all faith. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gady Gronich, and also your plea for self-reflection and atonement during this particular time frame, I think is very much pertinent. And also the reference that you made to freedom of religion and the practice by referring to the very concrete challenges when it comes to kosher halal meat and the male circumcision, and also the religious clothing. And I think that's also a nice segue to our next speaker from the regional perspective, Dr. Susan Kerr, especially since you mentioned that, and I quote you, that these recent rulings of the European Court of Justice make Europe inhospitable for Jews and other religious minorities. So I think in that context, obviously the OSCE is different than the European Union, but the region is the same. And we have Susan Kerr, who is the Senior Advisor on Freedom of Religion or Belief at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and its Office of the Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw. She began her career in the European Parliament, so then we are back to the European Union before joining ODIHR, and she advocated for human right to freedom of religion or belief from within the non-profit sector before. She holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Bradford and master degrees in business administration and international politics. So over to you to present the regional perspective, at least from the OSCE ODIHR perspective.
Well, thank you very much to Michael for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers of the G20 Interfaith Forum for inviting me here today. Now, this is obviously a huge topic with many different avenues that we could explore. So as time is short, I'll focus my comments around 2 points to address some of the challenges to minority protection and the advancement of freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, and other human rights as central to protection. Beyond the issue of defining minorities is the issue of state approaches vis-a-vis said minorities. The OSCE has a High Commissioner on National Minorities, notably on and not for national minorities, as the position is an independent one. The Commission has produced a number of publications, amongst which are the Ljubljana Guidelines on the Integration of Diverse Societies. These guidelines highlight that the discourse should be about the integration of society, not of minorities into society. So there should be a mutual accommodation within states. States should apply inclusive and not exclusionary approaches that imply a hierarchy of citizenship. States have an obligation to guarantee equal opportunities for everyone to participate in the economic, social, cultural, and political life of society. It's irrelevant whether they belong to majorities or minorities. But more than an obligation, states also have a practical interest in ensuring equal opportunities to participate. If diverse societies fail to put in place good integration policies, they risk that different communities may increasingly find that they have few or no common interests and no shared sense of belonging. Such separation into parallel and unconnected societies poses a considerable risk to the viability and stability of any state. Exclusionary approaches not only overlook the direct and indirect costs that a low participation by excluded or marginalized groups tends to bring to society as a result of reduced contributions to the common good, as well as the costs associated with policies to address the numerous consequences of exclusion. They also overlook the opportunities and benefits that minorities can play, amongst others, in the promotion of education and culture, in facilitating intercultural dialogue, and sometimes even in improving interstate relations. Because, as we all know, there can be a cross-border component to this issue. It was only in the last century that Europe saw the demise of multinational empires following World War I and subsequent changes in state boundaries with different ethnic groups separated from their motherlands. This is, of course, a factor that has also led certain states to advocate for the protection of certain minorities abroad. And this can have its challenges. For example, when motherlands confer en masse citizenship or politicize issues internationally, perhaps prioritizing national minorities overseas over those at home. Whilst we have to be careful not to conflate ethnicity and religion, at times members of certain ethnic minorities can be characterized as predominantly belonging to a particular religion, even if the religion means different things to different members of the group. This religious characteristic can then differentiate the members of a minority from those who are identified as believing and or belonging to the dominant religion or belief in the state where they reside. And another challenge is when it's assumed that everyone within a minority group subscribes to this single religion. We can then end up with legislation that aims to protect, but which discriminates against those who differ, enforcing conformity of everyone within a community, such as we've seen in parts of Latin America, for example. I think of, for example, Mexico, where we can see the negative side effects of the law of uses and customs, which grants significant autonomy to indigenous communities. And whilst the law should be exercised in line with constitutional human rights guarantees, in practice, this does not always occur. So what you see in practice then are local authorities trying to enforce conformity in terms of practice and belief, compelling members of the community to participate in religious activities or face punishment. Human rights violations range in severity, but in the absence of government intervention and a failure to hold perpetrators to account, all too often escalate to the point of forced displacement and beatings. Returning to the OSCE area, one aspect of ODIHR's work is monitoring hate crimes, as was mentioned, which most often affect individuals from minorities with different characteristics than the rest of the population. For anyone interested in our data, it is publicly available at hatecrime.osce.org. Now, by definition, such offenses under criminal law are acts motivated by bias. Religious bias is a factor that we see triggering hate crimes right across the OSCE. Sometimes crimes are perpetrated by organized groups, as has been mentioned, and at other times by individuals known to the victim, because religion is, of course, very personal. One indicator of hate crimes is often the intensity of violence used. In her introduction, Maria referred to concrete lived experiences. This is not just an abstract discussion, we're talking about real people. One indicator, as I mentioned, is the intensity of the violence used. And hate crimes not only affect individuals, but they send messages to families and entire communities. Looking at a couple of concrete examples to understand the types of hate crime that members of minority communities have faced in recent years. In one OSCE participating state, in 2019, a Jehovah's Witness girl had her head hit against a desk by a teacher at school, resulting in injuries. The incident occurred after the victim refused to sing the national anthem and place her hand on her heart, which of course, as a Jehovah's Witness, would have gone against her religious conviction. In another participating state in the same year, a Muslim family of African descent was repeatedly harassed due to their religion. The family's taxi windows were smashed, their car was stolen and set on fire, and their property was targeted in an attempted burglary. Now, of course, one major challenge in addressing these hate crimes can, of course, be access to justice. Gaps in monitoring or reporting do not help in raising awareness. A lack of understanding of what hate crimes are by law enforcement can be yet another challenge. And yet another can be the approachability of the police when no one in a local police station is from the minority, especially if there's a lack of trust of law enforcement or the state. At times, data shows that law enforcement has failed to intervene or has also been involved in the perpetration of the hate crime, even if this is the exception rather than the rule. And of course, all of this directly impacts upon individual freedom of religion or belief, the ability to manifest one's faith openly. People who are targeted because of a distinctive dress may avoid being seen in that dress. People who attend places of worship that are being targeted, maybe with graffiti or vandalism, may avoid attending those places of worship. And of course, I could go on. Hate crimes are obviously more obvious manifestations of discrimination than many forms of structural discrimination. Sometimes structural discrimination is intentional, other times it is institutionalized and unquestioned. And yet the two are intrinsically linked. By structural discrimination in the area of freedom of religion or belief, I can refer in the OSCE region to challenges such as the failure to grant legal personality, excessive interference in the autonomy of religious institutions, unequal treatment of different religious groups, and so on. These policies often stem from negative perceptions of minority religions, and these are the same prejudices that fuel hate crimes. A comprehensive response is needed when we look at the protection of minorities. Human rights meet basic human needs. Freedom of religion or belief meets a basic human need. So upholding human rights, including freedom of religion or belief, is core to the protection of minority groups. And it's core to the protection of society at large. It is core to a comprehensive vision of security, such as that subscribed to by the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which places human rights on an equal footing with the political and military dimensions of security. And lastly, and I will end here, for freedom of religion or belief practitioners, it's important I think it's really important and foundational to upholding human rights that we right-size freedom of religion or belief within the human rights framework, that we neither view it as the first right or as the orphaned right, both of which undermine the right, but that we recognize it as foundational to our ability to live together well in our diversity and foundational to the healing process. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Susan, for this plea, really also to look at it holistically. And I also very much appreciated your reference to the concrete cases, that it's affecting real people and it's not an abstract discussion. And you brought in these very specific cases from the also monitoring practice of the OSCE. And also the fact that you refer to this example of Jehovah's Witnesses. I think it's also an indication that it's not only the Abrahamic religions that are addressed, it's basically all religious or belief minorities. And also just to add that belief minorities includes also atheistic believers who are equally protected under Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So I think that's an important factor in our discussion today. And also your plea not to conflate ethnicity with religion. I think that's also fundamental in our discussions. With this, we will zoom in literally a person, Zhuo Xinping from China. I hope that the link works. Let me just introduce him. He is a native of Chile County in Hunan province. He graduated from the English department of Changde Teachers College and earned a master's degree in philosophy and a doctorate degree from philosophy department of Munich University in Germany. He served as a member of the 11th National People's Congress Standing Committee and of the Credentials Committee, and he was also director of the World Religion Research Institute of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and director of the Christianity Research Center of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So I hope that the link works and that you can hear us. And over to you, Zhuo Xinping.
Good morning. Many thanks for inviting me to this forum.
We can't hear you so far. Sorry, we just need to do a sound check.
Mm-hmm. Hello?
So if you can start speaking again, and then we hope to have you on the loudspeaker.
Yeah. Good morning. Many thanks for inviting me.
These are the joys of hybrid meetings, but I'm sure we will manage to overcome these technical problems. Can you repeat again, so just to check that we hear you loud and clear?
Yeah. Good morning. Many thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me?
If this doesn't work, we perhaps try again later. Yes. have you unmuted Zhou Xinping?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Yeah, I think hear me. It may be a problem on this end from a technical side. I would suggest also not to lose time, that we'll try to come back to Xinping Zhou later, and then we would have Ronald Rusband as the next speaker, who is live here with us. Let me just introduce him. He was called to the quorum of the 12 apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 2015. And Elder Rusband had been serving as a member of the presidency of the 70 since 2005, and was also serving as the senior president of the presidency when called to the 12. He was named a member of the first quorum of the 70 in 2000, and has served as a counselor in the Europe Central Area Presidency, was president of the Utah Salt Lake City area, executive director of the Temple Department, and has supervised the North America, West, Northwest, and 3 Utah areas as member of the presidency of the 70. So, Elder Rusband, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Co-chairs, thank you. Nice to be with you. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters of the same God, Father of us all, I'm grateful to be here with you today. I'm honored to attend this summit of all the distinguished visitors and guests that we have with us. Your willingness to live your beliefs and to protect others in the public square, desiring to do the same as a beacon of courage and goodness for all humans everywhere. In April of 2020, our church celebrated its 200th anniversary with a proclamation to the world. It begins with we solemnly proclaim God loves his children in every nation of the world. No matter the culture, color, creed, or country, God's love unites us to stand together to face down religious persecution of the type we've heard this morning. Throughout history, people of faith have suffered mightily at the hands of others. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is no different and no exception. My faith tradition and that of my own ancestors began in early 1820 in Palmyra, New York. Religious fervor consumed the hearts and minds of many in the United States at this time. 14-year-old Joseph Smith was one of them. He read these words in the Holy Bible. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Joseph did just that. He walked into a grove near the family farm, seeking to know his standing before God, and knelt in humble prayer. In response, we make a bold claim, ladies and gentlemen, that God the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, appeared to that boy, Joseph Smith. Later, Joseph was given a record of ancient prophetic writings that contained a history of a people in Jerusalem around 600 BC, who, by guidance of God, were led to the American continent. The record contains the teachings of Jesus Christ when he visited the Americas as a resurrected being following his crucifixion in Jerusalem. This record, known as the Book of Mormon, is a companion witness to the Holy Bible, another testament of Jesus Christ. In Joseph's day, many people were seeking God and were drawn to the unique teachings of this new religion. Joseph and his followers. Church members were killed, robbed, to Ohio, to Missouri, where the governor issued an order that members of our church, quote, must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, an extermination order in the United States of America. These early followers fled Illinois, where the small town of Quincy and its 1,500 residents, none of them members of our faith, took in 5,000 members of our church, husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, grandmas, grandpas, all refugees fleeing the threat of extermination. The good people of Quincy provided refuge to these refugees. Amid this turmoil, Joseph Smith published 13 fundamental tenets of this growing church, including this one, very appropriate for our gathering. Quote, we claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and allow all men the same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may, end quote. Months later, Joseph pledged this, quote, if it has been demonstrated that I have been willing to die for a Latter-day Saint, I am bold to declare before heaven that I am just as ready to die in defending the rights of a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or a good man of any other denomination, for the same principle which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints would trample upon the rights of the Roman Catholics, or of any other denomination who may be unpopular and too weak to defend itself. It is love of liberty that inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty to the whole of humanity, end quote. Joseph Smith's ministry was short. In 1844, he was confined in a small jail, wrongly confined, by the way, in Carthage, Illinois, on false charges when a mob of 200 stormed the building and killed Joseph and his brother Hiram. Enemies, though striking down Joseph, they thought would kill this church, but the faithful carried on. Joseph's successor, Brigham Young, led a forced exodus of thousands of religious refugees 1,300 miles west to what is now the state of Utah. My own ancestors were part of those early settlers.
Can you hear me?
From those days of intense persecution, our church has grown steadily now to some 17 million members, half of them living outside of the United States of America. We share with many of you a commitment to God and charity. True religion prompts us to help those in need. There is no question that the world needs all of us and our desire to go about doing good with the promise that God will be with us. When religion is given the freedom to flourish, believers everywhere perform simple and sometimes heroic acts of service. For example, this year alone, many of you and other nonprofit organizations partnered with us in 160 countries. That includes significant contributions to COVAX, a global effort to provide 2 billion, that's with a B, 2 billion COVID-19 vaccines all around the world. Religious belief and practice are excellent predictors of service. Catholic charities known as Caritas International and Islamic Relief and any number of Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, or Christian organizations like the Salvation Army and the National Christian Foundation carry out essential relief efforts and social services to tens of millions of people. They do this for anyone and everyone. Our church delivered more than 26 million meals to feed the hungry this last year. We also carried out 294 projects for refugees in 50 different countries with many other partner religions and organizations, helping with shelter, health support, and refugee resettlement. The ancient Jewish phrase, tikkun olam, meaning to repair or heal the world, is reflected in the efforts of so many faith traditions. Literacy programs, clean water wells, filled hospitals following earthquakes, food during famines, rebuilt homes after natural disasters, assistance to the refugee populations. The list is long, but so are the needs in our world today. As we all go about doing good, we contribute to the growth and stability of diverse countries. A study in 2016 from the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation reported that religion contributes about 1.2 trillion of social economic value annually just in the US economy. That, according to scholar Brian Grimm, is equivalent to being the world's 15th largest natural economy. It's more than the global annual revenues of the world's top 10 tech companies, including Apple, Amazon, and Google. If that is the impact of faith in America, imagine what faith can do across the entire globe. That's why protecting all faiths, even small minority faiths, like we were and like we are, is critical. When people feel confident that their beliefs will always be protected, they will reach out to others in significant ways. Dr. Grimm's research shows a correlation between robust religious freedom and other vital human rights. I have shared the story of my faith tradition. Once a very persecuted minority, today we reach out to others around the world in partnership and relationship. Like the lowly mustard seed described by Jesus Christ in the New Testament, today we are a tree with branches that extend refugee and care to many. Many other minority faiths have similar stories to ours. The good of religion, the reach of religion, and the heroic acts of love which religion inspires only multiply when we protect all of our religious freedom. We stand shoulder to shoulder in service with all of you. I hope that universal goodness, prompted by faith traditions, will be honored and admired. People around the world are blessed as we lift and encourage others through life-saving aid. May we be grateful for the opportunity to make a difference. In these ways, we fulfill and expand the truth. God loves all his children in every nation of the world, even amongst the smallest minorities amongst us. This is my hope and my prayer, and in our faith tradition, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, amen.
Many thanks, Elder Rasband, also for reminding us of the history of persecution that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have faced in the United States also. And I just wanted to repeat your statement that true religion prompts us to help those in need. And I think the examples that you gave in terms of vaccination with COVAX or feeding the hungry and projects with refugees were very clear and practical. Shall we try again to, I hope that the sound problems with Zhuo Xinping have been resolved in the meantime?
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes, we can hear you, and
okay,
the
good.
yours.
So many thanks for inviting me to this forum. I'm going to talk about the Chinese religions, freedom, and the contextualization. China has a long history of various religions and also a rich and vigorous life of beliefs. Some of these religions and folk beliefs are still very active in contemporary Chinese society. They belong namely to the essential components of China's social structure. Reflecting this history, the free existence and the development of these religions in China are closely connected with the enculturation and the contextualization in the Chinese society. In the general interpretation, Confucianism was considered as a religion in the past and understood namely as the religion of the ethnic Han Chinese. Confucianism is in its dominant position as the official ideology and was good protected, and its close relationship with the feudal dynasty in Chinese history formed the foundation of the intermingling of social politics and religion. When the 1911 revolution overthrew the Qing dynasty and ended the feudal system in China, Confucian religion would also visit. Since then, Confucianism is no more considered as a religion for the majority of the Chinese, and its significance for China today is also frequently discussed. Besides Confucianism, the so-called Chinese native religions were referring to Buddhism and Taoism relatively, but their social positions were changeable. And in order to get their freedom of existence and their social protection, they had often compilation for their social contextualization, namely the so-called unification of these three religions in the past. In this case, Buddhism and Taoism had to play an active role in the relationship between social politics and the religion as well. In the process of interacting with politics, these religions have adopted two different approaches in their social existence and development. The first approach is to exist beyond the authority of state and to maintain a distance from politics. By such practice, religious believers had then little connection with the society and lived in a secluded place. As a result, such a religion would be marginalized and lose its social responsibility. In contrast, other religious leaders thought that affiliating with politics was the convenient way for religion's development in the society. This attitude of adaptation had a positive result for the Buddhist development afterwards, and especially changed its relation between state and religion. Since then, Buddhism got more freedom for its development in China and also strong political support from the Chinese emperors. This was also the beginning of the Sinicization of Buddhism in China. The same is true for Taoism. Its relation with the society and especially with the social politics should be essential for its free existence and development. With fundamental social change, religions in China now are indeed a phenomenon of minority, but the relationship of social politics and religion in contemporary China is still important and reflects to a certain extent a continuation of the ancient tradition. It is quite clear that the freedom of religion is closely connected with the adaptation of religion into this new socialist context. So there is a logical consequence, namely the confidence of religion to the society will have the positive result of social acceptance and embracement of such a religion. In this context, there are 5 officially recognized religions in China, including Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Protestantism, and Catholicism. Among all, only Taoism is a real native religion of the Chinese. All the rest have their international background, and thus they are called world religions. Obviously, followers of these religions tend to have a self-identity that is beyond the national boundary. They look for universal and shared identity through its transnational religions network. Their decision about being loyal to the state or to their religion might change during the process when they linger around their national and religious identity. And this complex situation, there might be tension between those religions and the Chinese society because there are many external intervening factors that are beyond state control and the social acceptance. Due to the competition of resources and other factors, religions in China have to face their attitude and the choice in this context. And the religious dialogue and the culture exchange are absolutely necessary. Since religion lives no more in a closed, small society, but in an open and much broader society, it needs to make a balance between their spiritual tradition and the social background. Its confrontation and resistance against such a society is surely harmful to its free existence and protection in this society. This is why the freedom of religion is closely connected with its contextualization, which means basically the law-abiding and ideally the social accommodation. So the social acceptance and consensus with the living culture by religions with international background are emphasized in China. Specifically, we call for the civicization of all religions in China, which is also dialogue and confluence of various cultures in contemporary China, and a welcome at home of all religions in China. Civicization of religions in China is concrete action and the realization of religion's contextualization and inculturation, which is also the social guarantee of religion's freedom and its protection as minority. In contemporary China, a new positive attitude is constructive in terms of understanding religion. The new understanding of religion's existence in Chinese society and its function in this society should be taken from religion's participation and contribution to the present construction of this harmonious society. So civicization of religions in China will witness the opening of the Chinese culture to world civilizations, demonstrating the influence and appeal of the spirit of the Chinese faith to the world. In culture understanding and exchange, we can reach finally a consensus to the freedom of religions and beliefs in human society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for this perspective from China, and apologies for sometimes the audio quality, which obviously due to the Zoom hybrid meeting was sometimes not perfect. In the interest of time, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ahmed Tabakovic from the Islamic community of Bosnians in Italy. So we are very much looking forward to hearing your perspective also here from Italy. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wiener. Professor D'Arienzo. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon. Is it already? In the name of God, the most merciful, the most peaceful. I'm going today to give a short overview of what Muslim theology, or in some cases, jurisprudence, did for the case of minorities in Europe. And also, I'm going to talk about the active citizenship. The terrorist and or violent events that swept across Western Europe, North America, and Australia in the past, in last 2 decades, have triggered heavy debates on the integration of Muslims in those countries. A visibly present element in such debates is a perception that the integration of Muslim immigrants in Western liberal democracies is particularly problematic and in most cases unlikely. The reasoning behind such a perception finds its most articulate form in the European debates and is expressed in the form of 4 axiomatic statements. First one is that Muslim immigrants tend not to integrate into host societies. Second one is this lack of integration is the product of a conscious decision. Third one is that this decision is made because the goal of Muslim immigrants is to dominate rather than to blend into Western societies. And fourth one is that there are no variations within Muslims, no extremist moderate, and no conservative liberal distinctions. A very important and interesting development among these theoretization efforts is a new jurisprudential approach known as Fiqh al-Aqaliyat al-Muslima, or the jurisprudence of Muslim minorities. This title refers to a growing body of Islamic juristical rulings and conceptualizations that emerged in the latter half of the 1990s, thanks to the contribution of Muslim scholars such as Yusuf al-Qaradawi and the late Taha Jabir al-Alwani, and aimed at addressing the particular challenges faced by Muslims who were living in non-Muslim countries. The basic premise of this new school of thought is that the realities of the lives of the Muslims living in non-Muslim countries are so fundamentally different from those of the Muslim majority nations that the traditional Islamic jurisprudence cannot offer meaningful solutions to their problems. There is therefore a need to establish an entirely different jurisprudential and theological approach as the basis for the solutions to the problems faced by Muslim minorities. However, the 20th century gave the presence of Muslims in non-Muslim lands an entirely new facelift, larger numbers immigrating voluntarily, mostly in search of economic opportunities, coming from many different origins, going to a variety of destinations. In the last quarter of that century, all those trends intensified significantly, and at that time, the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims became a very sensitive issue. There was another fundamental difference between the old and the recent Muslim minorities. While the former groups were minority only in a demographic and not in a power sense, the latter ones were minorities in terms of both. The distinct nature of the experiences of new immigrant Muslim minorities brought about distinct challenges and new questions. With the significant increases in the number of Muslim immigrants, their prolonged stays in non-Muslim countries, and particularly with the emergence of second and the third generation Muslims, this initial response started losing its relevance to the lives of Muslim immigrant minorities. The challenges faced by this new wave of Muslim immigrants generated an increasingly long list of requests for religious expert views on many issues, ranging from mundane daily problems related to food and drink to much larger problems related to the country's politics and role in international conflicts. It has become a common argument in the public rhetoric across the West to claim that the Islamic faith, or Islam, is inherently incompatible with liberal democratic values and thus constitutes a cultural threat to society and the political community. Such allegations are expressed blatantly and overtly at the far right political spectrum to legitimize an exclusivist Islamophobic agenda. But they have also penetrated segments of the public discourse across the political and societal mainstream in many Western countries, where they are usually articulated more subtly. Given the diversity of Muslim communities in the West and the complexities of Islamic doctrines, sects, schools of thought, and above all, Muslims' individual Islamic spirituality, it seems, however, unfeasible to ultimately answer these questions once and for all. Instead of focusing on the Islamic faith as a rigid system based on literate reading of Quranic sources, which, like other religious scripts, clearly contains norms that are hard to reconcile with some modern values, it might be more insightful to explore Muslims' lived religiosity in the 21st century. The growing number of practicing Muslims who have pursued a political career in the West or become active in civil society, but also the millions of Muslims who participate in general elections across Western countries, for example, suggests that being Muslim is not an obstacle to active citizenship. Active citizenship is a key concept. While there is no unanimous consensus on what exactly active citizenship encompasses, the term is generally used to convey an understanding of citizenship that emphasizes the dynamic aspects of performative processes rather than the static aspect of holding equal legal rights. This is in line with the prevalent conceptualization of citizenship in contemporary scholarship, as well as political discourses that highlight the procedural enactment of citizenship through civic and political participation in liberal democracies. Uninformed about the incredible intellectual vitality among Muslim minorities, the popular debates on the place of such minorities in Western liberal democracies that operate under simplistic, if not false, assumptions at first that Muslim minorities tend not to integrate into their new homes, and that the main reason for this is the particular teachings of Islam that prohibit or discourage such an integration. Putting the obvious essentialism and reductionism involved in such arguments inside, this study focused on a recent and very important intellectual development within the Muslim communities, that is a new school of thought within Islamic jurisprudence known as Fiqhul Aqalliyat al-Muslima, or the jurisprudence of Muslim minorities. The basic premise of this new school of thought is that the realities of the lives of those Muslims who are living in non-Muslim countries are so fundamentally different from those of the Muslim majority nations that the traditional Islamic jurisprudence cannot offer meaningful solutions for their problems, and there is therefore a need to establish an entirely different approach centered around the lives of the Muslim minorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much also for flagging the particular situation, especially 20 years after 9/11 that the various Muslim communities are facing. So especially after the 20th anniversary last Saturday, I think this is a very pertinent reminder. As the final speaker, we will have Mohamed Al-Zuhaibi. He's a consultant educator and worked in government and private sectors and also in the non-profit sector. And his main area of specialization is global citizenship. So please, the floor is yours. And
thank you, Chairman and Co-Chairman. My background is education. The day before, I was asked to participate in this session and to shed some light how the issue of minorities perceived and approached within an educational context. As you all aware, the Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations, the goal number 4 says, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. If you follow the speech in this forum, including this session, you'll find 3 words come every now and then: inclusion, inclusive, inclusiveness. So in education, we use a framework called inclusive education. Inclusive education, it's a framework that is not reactive to protecting minorities. It's rather a proactive, preventive framework to engage and give space for minorities. So this is the difference in education context. Inclusive education refers to the valuing and acceptance of diversity, active participation from all participants in the educational context or community, the elimination of barriers limiting the participation from everyone, high expectations of achievement for all learners, regardless of their ethnicity, background, or economic status, respect for diverse needs and abilities. The framework of inclusive education started first with the medical point of view, then grew up for special need framework, but now it's broader with the social framework that includes every kind of disability within the humankind. Inclusive education is about a fundamental shift in the existing of education system. From saying differences or the difference as a problem to be fixed, to celebrating the diversity of learners and providing all necessary support to enable equal participation. There are 4 elements of every inclusive education. Inclusion is not a primary an educational or professional issue, but as an issue of basic human rights concerning everybody. Inclusion is an ongoing process of increasing participation, not a fixed state. Inclusive schools help the development of inclusive communities. Usually we see schools as a tool, as a solution for all of our problems. Inclusive schools help the development of inclusive communities where all people are equally valued. The voices of disadvantaged have key roles in developing inclusion. The students experience inclusive education when they can, first, access and fully participate in learning alongside their similar aged peers, supported by reasonable adjustment and teaching strategies tailored to meet their individual needs. Inclusion is embedded in all aspects of school life and is supported by culture, policies, everyday practices. There are some success factors if we are going to use or to employ inclusive education. First, inclusion is a basic right, not a compromise. Second, ongoing, not seasonal or reactive. Third, holistic, not selective or limited. There are bad and good news about inclusive education within the schools. There is an international study called PISA, the Program for International Students Achievement, conducted every 3 years, and around more than 80 countries participating in this study, and it's targeting the 15 years old students. Let's start with the bad news. The minorities, they are at risk groups within each school. So they will be bullied within the school because of their background or religion or economic status. On average, around the world, about a quarter of students reported being bullied at least few times a month. Students who were bullied, their achievement, they are 20 points lower than the average students. The students who reported being frequently exposed to bullying also reported feeling sad, scared, and less satisfied with their lives, and they have a weaker sense of belonging. The good news is about 90% of students in all countries participate in these studies agreed that is a good thing to help students who cannot defend themselves. And it's wrong to join a bullying. So the bulliers, the bullying makers, they are a minority. They are not the majority. There are three main challenges if we're going to employ an inclusive education framework. The first challenge is the continuity. Can we continue to do it all the way from the kindergarten to the university? The second one, the consistency between across teachers, I'm just closing, across teachers, across subjects, across schools, across regions. The third challenge, which I conclude with, the alignment with other policies within the educational settings or outside the educational settings. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for your flagging also of the importance of inclusive education and of a holistic approach in that context and of active participation. I think that is also key. It shouldn't be just shoveled on someone top down, but it should really be participatory. And I think peer-to-peer learning is really one thing which works best and really has lasting effects. And there are many, many tools available. And in that context, perhaps the Faith for Rights Toolkit is one of the most recent examples bringing together the various approaches. I would like to give the floor last to Gady, Gronich, because he flagged on the paper a very important point. So what next? What is the next step and what should be done? And I think he has some ideas.
Thank you. I will do it very, very short. I would like to ask to call all religious leaders and political who are involved in this forum, in these meetings, to join together, not to speak each for themselves. Let's speak together as one voice. If not, we could meet again in 1, in 2, in 3 years, there will nothing move, nothing change. It's our, I don't want to say last minute, but we are very close to our last minute to make a change, but we can only do it if we do it together, stay above all other conflict that maybe we have or don't have or think we have, and join forces and move together. And I would like really, as standing here in the name of the Conference of European Rabbis and the Jewish population in Europe, join us, let's speak together, and let's call a call to speak together, to discuss what needs to be done and how we do it together. Thank you.
A conclusione di questa sessione così piena di spunti appunto di riflessione, volevo ringraziare appunto tutti i relatori per queste prospettive diverse con cui sono state riguardati i problemi appunto relativi alla tutela della libertà religiosa come tutela dell'identità, quindi anche di quella dell'espressione della libertà dell'identità religiosa, quella della pratiche di culto, ma anche pratiche identitarie, come è stato sottolineato anche da molti relatori, e anche queste prospettive che sono nuove e tradizionali di discriminazione, ma anche nuove come quelli appunto che la pandemia ha soltanto evidenziato. E, particolarmente interessante è quello appunto che emerge anche dai diversi appunto interventi, e questo costante impegno che nel promuovere appunto questa inclusione, che però nasce non tanto da politiche di inclusione, quindi dall'alto, ma nasce invece dal basso, nasce da un tessuto che si crea attraverso la collaborazione, la cooperazione delle comunità religiose tutte, a prescindere da essere minoritari o maggioritari in un certo contesto, perché è tutto basato proprio sulla difesa e sulla tutela di quelli che sono i diritti di ognuno, i diritti della persona, che sono alla base poi della tutela della libertà religiosa e la base anche di qualsiasi forma di giustizia sociale. Quindi e questo richiama l'impegno anche delle comunità rispetto alle altre comunità, rispetto a tutti. Quindi diventa veramente un lavoro appunto di sinergia nella costruzione di un tessuto sociale. Ringrazio tutti e buon prosieguo.